What do you do when the people you love the most betray you? This is the raw, emotional journey of how I uncovered a devastating secret that shook my family to its core. From growing up in suburban Ohio, living in my brother's shadow, to facing a betrayal I never expected, this is a story about resilience, second chances, and finding hope when everything feels lost. Join me as I share my experience moving to a new city to rebuild my life, repairing broken relationships, and fighting to protect the ones who matter most. Growing up in suburban Ohio during the late 90s, I always sensed my family dynamics were different from those of my friends. Our home, a modest single-story house tucked in a quiet neighborhood with perfectly trimmed lawns and welcoming porches, looked picture-perfect from the outside. But inside, things were far from ideal. My mom, Carol, was the classic PTA mom to anyone looking in, always baking cookies, heading up school events, and ensuring my younger brother David and I were dressed to impress. Yet, her unwavering devotion seemed to belong solely to David. David was the golden child, there was no denying it. Mom coddled him in a way that made it clear he could do no wrong. When I was 10, I vividly remember an incident during a summer barbecue. David accidentally broke our neighbor's cherished garden gnome while showing off with a soccer ball. Instead of holding him accountable, Mom quickly spun a story about how the wind must have knocked it over. "He's just a kid," she said, brushing it off with a laugh while I stood there speechless, knowing the truth. Moments like these became a pattern. While David basked in her attention, I learned early to fend for myself. By the time I was 12, I could cook basic meals, help with household chores, and even manage my homework without reminders. It wasn't that I didn't try to reach out to her, I did, often. But my efforts seemed invisible, as though my achievements weren't significant enough to catch her eye. If David aced a spelling test, it was a celebration with ice cream and cheers. If I brought home straight A's, I was lucky to get a casual, "That's nice, dear," before she turned back to whatever she was doing. My dad, Rick, was a quiet man who worked long hours as a truck driver, often away for days at a time. He was kind in his own way, always bringing me small souvenirs from his trips, a keychain from Chicago, a postcard from Denver. Yet, his presence felt fleeting, and I often longed for his firm but loving guidance to help me navigate the unspoken hierarchy in our family. He seemed to sense the imbalance but never challenged Mom on it, perhaps too tired from the long hours he put in to keep food on the table. As I grew older, I buried myself in books and schoolwork, finding solace in worlds where characters overcome challenges to find their worth. At school, I was known as the reliable, quiet girl who helped others with assignments and stayed out of trouble. Teachers often praised me for my maturity, but at home, it felt like I was just part of the furniture, a piece of the background while David starred in every family narrative. The unfairness in our family didn't just stop at Mom's blatant favoritism. David, ever the opportunist, seemed to revel in the power her bias gave him. He wasn't content just being the golden child, he used it as a tool to torment me, pushing boundaries in ways that often left me feeling humiliated and powerless. David had a knack for turning even the simplest things into weapons of chaos. I remember one morning in the fall of 2003, as the air started to cool and the leaves were just beginning to change. I was about 14, and breakfast was always a rushed affair before school. I sat at the kitchen table, still groggy, pouring cereal into my bowl. Just as I took the first bite, I felt an awful crunch that sent a sharp jolt through my jaw. I spat it out, only to discover tiny pebbles mixed in with the flakes. My tongue stung from the grit, and I could already feel the ache of a bruised tooth. David, sitting across the table, burst into laughter, his face lighting up with pure delight. "Gotcha," he said, his voice ringing out with that irritating mix of pride and mischief. I glared at him, furious. "What is wrong with you?" I shouted, holding up a handful of cereal laced with rocks. Before I could even finish my sentence, Mom appeared, coffee cup in hand, her usual morning exhaustion painted across her face. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone already exasperated. "He put rocks in my cereal, Mom," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. But instead of scolding him, she just sighed and gave me that dismissive wave she always seemed to reserve for me. "Oh, stop making a big deal out of it. That's just how brothers play. You're too sensitive. Too sensitive." Those words felt like a slap. David smirked, knowing he'd just gotten away with it, and casually went back to eating his pancakes as if nothing had happened. I stared at my bowl, the anger simmering inside me, but there was nothing I could do. Mom had spoken, and in her eyes, that was the end of it. But David's antics didn't stop at pebbles and cereal. A few months later, during winter break, he pulled a stunt that still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. It was late December, and the house smelled of cinnamon and pine from the Christmas decorations Mom had lovingly put up. The fire crackled in the living room, and outside, the first snow of the season blanketed the neighborhood. It should have been a cozy, happy time. I was sitting on the carpet by the fireplace, flipping through a magazine. David had been hovering nearby, too quiet, always a bad sign. Suddenly, I felt a rush of heat near the back of my head, followed by the acrid smell of burning hair. I spun around, and there he was, holding one of Dad's long-reach lighters with a twisted grin on his face. "David!" I screamed, frantically patting the back of my head to make sure the damage wasn't worse. A few strands of my hair had singed, the edges curling up in blackened wisps. Tears stung my eyes, a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. Mom came running, her slippers slapping against the hardwood floor. I pointed at David, the lighter still in his hand. He tried to burn my hair. I shouted, my voice cracking. But instead of the scolding I expected, she rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, stop being so dramatic. He didn't mean it. It's just how siblings mess around." Her tone was light, almost amused, as if setting your sister's hair on fire was the equivalent of a playful noogie. I couldn't believe it. Mess around? He could have seriously hurt me. I protested, but my words fell on deaf ears. She grabbed the lighter from David and wagged her finger at him half-heartedly. "No more of this, okay," she said, her tone lacking any real conviction. Then she turned to me and added, "You need to learn to let things go. You're too uptight." David snickered behind her, and I felt my face flush with humiliation. It was like living in a parallel universe where the rules of fairness didn't apply to me. No matter what he did, he was untouchable. And no matter how much I pleaded, I was always the one overreacting. That summer, Dad had promised me a red bicycle. Not just any bike, but one of those shiny Schwinn models with the curved handlebars and a basket in front, a big deal for a kid in our quiet Ohio neighborhood. He said it was mine if I got straight A's on my report card, and I worked harder than ever that year. By the end of the school term, I had done it. The day my grades arrived in the mail, I proudly handed the report card to Dad, practically buzzing with excitement. True to his word, the following Saturday, we went to the local bike shop on Main Street. The store smelled of new rubber tires and chain grease, and the walls were lined with colorful bikes that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Dad picked out the exact one I'd been dreaming of, and I rode it home that afternoon, grinning ear to ear. It felt like freedom, like my hard work had finally paid off. But the joy didn't last long. The very next day, David threw one of his infamous tantrums. He was 7 at the time, and he had mastered the art of crying in a way that could make walls crumble. Standing in the driveway, he wailed and stomped, tears streaking his chubby cheeks, pointing at my new bike as though it had personally insulted him. "I want one too," he cried, his voice echoing through the neighborhood. Mom came out to see what the fuss was about, and within minutes, she was on David's side. "You can't expect him to just watch you ride around without having one of his own," she said, as though it made perfect sense. I watched in disbelief as Dad quietly wheeled my shiny red bike into the garage. By that evening, the bike wasn't mine anymore, it was ours. Except, of course, David was the only one who got to ride it. I don't think I ever touched it again. I didn't argue. What was the point? Instead, I swallowed my disappointment and told myself it was just a bike. But even at 10, I couldn't ignore the pattern forming. If David wanted something, it didn't matter who it belonged to. Years later, when I was a teenager, the stakes felt higher. By then, I had learned to keep my head down, focus on school, and avoid confrontations at home. Around junior year, I started dating a girl from my high school named Sarah. She was sweet, with curly brown hair and a laugh that made you want to laugh along even if you didn't know what was funny. She was the first person outside my family who made me feel like I mattered, and I was smitten. When I finally worked up the nerve to introduce her to my family, I was nervous but hopeful. It was a warm spring afternoon, and I invited Sarah over for dinner. Mom cooked her famous meatloaf, and Dad even put on a clean shirt for the occasion. Everything seemed to be going well until David got involved. He was about 14 at the time, right in the middle of his class clown phase. As soon as Sarah walked through the door, David turned on the charm. He started cracking jokes, showing off his basketball trophies, and even pulling out magic tricks he'd learned from a kit Mom bought him for Christmas. At first, Sarah laughed politely, but as the evening went on, I could tell she was paying more attention to him than to me. David had a way of commanding the room, and I could feel myself fading into the background. The worst part came after dinner. We were sitting in the living room, and David plopped himself down right between Sarah and me on the couch. He started teasing her in that playful way that teenage boys do, making her laugh harder than I ever could. I just sat there, awkward and quiet, feeling invisible in my own home. By the end of the night, I was too frustrated to even walk her to the door. David beat me to it, of course, grinning over his shoulder as he said goodnight to her. That relationship didn't last long, and while I can't blame David entirely, the whole experience left a mark. It wasn't just about Sarah. It was about the realization that David couldn't let me have anything, not a bike, not a moment of attention, not even a chance at happiness. It was as if he saw my joy as a threat to his own. And the worst part was, my parents never saw a problem with it. That's just how brothers are, Mom would say, brushing off my feelings like dust on the coffee table. Looking back now, I wonder if I should have fought harder for the things I cared about. But at the time, it felt easier to let it go, to silently accept that in my family, I was always second place. When I graduated high school in the spring of 2006, I felt like I was finally breaking free. I'd received a full scholarship to Ohio State University, a miracle in my eyes, and it was my one-way ticket out of the suffocating environment I'd called home for 18 years. Packing up my belongings that summer felt like shedding old skin. I wasn't just leaving my house, I was leaving behind years of feeling unseen and unheard. The day I left, I remember standing in the driveway with my beat-up duffel bag and a box of essentials. Mom hugged me briefly, her arms stiff like she wasn't sure whether to celebrate or mourn the moment. David barely looked up from his Xbox. Dad, as always, was quiet, offering a gruff, "Take care of yourself," before heading back to the garage. I didn't expect a grand send-off, but it still stung a little. Then again, the silence was fitting, it mirrored the way I'd lived my life under their roof. Moving into my dorm at Ohio State was like stepping into another universe. The campus buzzed with energy. Students zipped by on skateboards, lugged boxes into dorms, and filled the air with the chatter of new beginnings. My roommate, Jason, was from upstate New York, a laid-back guy with a mop of curly hair and a love for punk rock. We clicked instantly, bonding over late-night pizza runs and bad horror movies. For the first time, I wasn't David's brother or the family's afterthought. I was just me. College wasn't just about the classes, though I loved them. I majored in psychology, fascinated by how people's minds worked, maybe because I was still trying to understand my own family dynamics. But it was also about discovering the freedom I'd been craving. I could eat cereal at midnight without worrying about David's pranks. I could leave my stuff wherever I wanted without it mysteriously disappearing. I could finally breathe. And then there was Karen. I met Karen during my sophomore year at a campus event for student volunteers. She was a nursing major with a laugh that could light up a room and a knack for making everyone around her feel at ease. She had this energy about her, calm but vibrant, like she knew exactly who she was and didn't need to prove it to anyone. It was the kind of confidence I'd never felt but desperately admired. We were assigned to the same community project, organizing health workshops for local middle schoolers. It started with small talk over stacks of flyers and evolved into late-night conversations about everything: her childhood in Cincinnati, my dreams of breaking away from my family's shadow, and what we both wanted for the future. Karen wasn't just someone I liked, she was someone who made me feel like I mattered. One fall evening, after a long day of volunteering, we grabbed coffee at a small cafe just off campus. The place had an eclectic vibe: mismatched chairs, local art on the walls, and the faint sound of indie music playing in the background. As we sat there, sipping hot chocolate, she hated coffee, she asked me about my family. I hesitated, not sure how to explain the tangle of emotions tied to the word home. But Karen had this way of listening that made you feel safe, so I opened up. I told her about David and the bike and the pebbles in the cereal. I told her about the burning hair and the nights I spent wishing someone, anyone, would see me. She didn't interrupt or try to downplay it. She just reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "You deserved better." No one had ever said that to me before. Not in those words. And for the first time, I believed it. Our relationship grew from there. Karen wasn't just my girlfriend, she became my anchor. She showed me what a healthy relationship looked like, one built on mutual respect, kindness, and honesty. We'd spend weekends exploring Columbus, from the bustling North Market to the quiet trails of Schiller Park. We'd cook together in her tiny off-campus apartment, laughing as we botched recipes and burned cookies. Every moment with her felt like a glimpse of the life I'd always wanted but never thought I'd have. By the time we graduated, I was convinced Karen was the one. I imagined us building a family together, a family free of the toxicity I'd grown up with. In my mind, she was my fresh start, my chance to create something better than what I'd left behind. For the first time, my future felt full of hope. But life, as I would later learn, doesn't always go according to plan. When Karen first met David, it was during that Thanksgiving trip I'd mentioned earlier. She'd heard me talk about him before, but meeting him in person was different. David had this way of captivating people, like he could read the room and instantly become the most charming version of himself. I'd seen him do it with teachers, coaches, even friends' parents. Karen wasn't immune to it, either. At first, she laughed at his jokes and humored his constant need to be the center of attention. She didn't know then what I knew: David's charm had a dark side. At first, Karen thought it was harmless. She'd tell me later that she even felt a little sorry for him, chalking up his behavior to sibling rivalry or the kind of attention-seeking antics younger brothers often pull. He'd make playful comments like, "You sure you want to stick with my brother? I'm way more fun." She thought it was just his sense of humor, a little obnoxious but not threatening. But then there was that day I ran to the store with Dad. That was when things took a turn. Karen said David waited until the house was quiet, Mom was in the kitchen, and Karen had stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. He joined her on the back porch, leaning casually against the railing like he belonged there. She told me his tone shifted, becoming more intense, less playful. He started making remarks that weren't so innocent anymore, things that made her feel trapped. "You know, you don't have to settle for him," he'd said, his voice low. "You deserve someone who can really keep up with you." Karen tried to laugh it off, but when she turned to leave, he grabbed her wrist, not hard, but firm enough to make her stop. "I mean it, Karen," he said, stepping closer. "Think about it." She pulled away, muttering something about needing to help my mom, and hurried back inside. She didn't tell me about this at the time, hoping it was a one-off incident she could ignore. But it wasn't. Over the next few months, David found ways to linger in Karen's life. He'd text her casually, using excuses like asking for advice or sharing a funny meme. She'd reply politely at first, not wanting to cause tension. But then the messages became more persistent, more personal. "You looked amazing last weekend," he'd write after a family gathering. "Does my brother even notice how lucky he is?" Karen tried to set boundaries. She stopped responding to his texts and avoided him at family events. But David wasn't the kind of person to let go easily. When she finally confronted him, during a family barbecue at my parents' house, he showed his true colors. She told me later about the conversation, her voice trembling with the memory. It happened in the backyard while I was inside grabbing drinks. David cornered her by the grill, his charming mask slipping away. "You think you can just cut me off?" he hissed. "You really think I'm going to stay quiet about everything?" "About what happened?" "David, this was a mistake," Karen said, trying to stay calm. "I love him. I don't want anything to do with you." He laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that lightens the mood. It was sharp, cutting. "Love? If you loved him, you wouldn't have let things get this far," he shot back. "Don't pretend you're better than me, Karen. You're just scared I'll tell him the truth." Karen felt trapped. She knew she hadn't been perfect. There were moments, especially in the beginning, when David's attention had made her feel flattered, even special. But she'd realized quickly that it was a path she didn't want to go down. She tried to end it before it spiraled further, but David wasn't the type to accept rejection gracefully. His threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Karen felt powerless to stop it. She told me she tried to act normal after that, but the weight of his words followed her everywhere. She'd sit across from me at dinner, forcing a smile while secretly wondering if David would actually go through with his threat. Her anxiety started to seep into our relationship in ways I couldn't ignore. I began noticing the changes in her behavior. She'd avoid eye contact during conversations or come up with excuses to stay late at work. Karen had always been transparent with me, but now it felt like she was hiding something. Little things started adding up, missing phone calls, vague explanations, and a constant tension I couldn't put my finger on. It's funny how you can live with someone, see them every day, and yet feel like you're standing on the outside looking in. That's how it felt with Karen in those weeks leading up to the night I found the receipt. At first, I brushed off the little things, the way she avoided eye contact when we talked, how she'd suddenly become too busy for our Friday night movie tradition. But over time, those little things started to stack up, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. Karen had always been an open book. One of the things I loved most about her was how easy she was to talk to, how honest she was about her day-to-day life. But lately, it felt like she was hiding something. She'd come home late from work, claiming she'd been caught up in meetings or stuck in traffic. But the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she was reading from a script. It wasn't just the lateness, though. She'd started guarding her phone like it held state secrets, setting it face down on the table and taking it with her even to the bathroom. When I asked her about it, she'd laugh nervously and say something like, "It's just work stuff. Nothing interesting." But the look in her eyes told a different story. Then there was that day, Tuesday evening. I remember it clearly, when I was looking for some old paperwork in our room. Karen was in the kitchen making dinner, and I was rifling through the desk drawer when I noticed her purse sitting on the chair. Normally, I wouldn't even think twice about it, but something made me pause. I don't know if it was instinct or just paranoia, but I picked up her purse and opened it. That's when I saw it, a crumpled hotel receipt folded at the bottom. I smoothed it out and stared at it, my chest tightening. The date was recent, just 2 weeks ago, on a day she told me she was working late. In the hotel, it wasn't even in another city. It was 15 minutes away, right here in town. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe she'd gone there for a meeting or some kind of work event. But why wouldn't she have mentioned it? Why did she hide the receipt in her purse like it was something she didn't want me to find? I put the receipt back and walked downstairs, my mind racing. Karen was humming to herself in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta like everything was normal. But to me, nothing felt normal anymore. I sat at the table, watching her, trying to decide how to bring it up. My hands were clammy, my heart pounding. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Karen," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She turned, startled. "What's this?" I held up the receipt, my hand trembling slightly. She froze, her eyes darting from the receipt to me. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and defensiveness. "In your purse," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. I was looking for some paperwork and it fell out. Why didn't you tell me about this? She hesitated, and in that moment, I could see her mind working, trying to come up with a plausible story. It's nothing, she said quickly. Just a work thing. I didn't think it was important. A work thing? I repeated, my skepticism evident. At a hotel 15 minutes from here? She flinched at the question but tried to recover. Sometimes we have off-site meetings, she said, avoiding my gaze. I didn't want to bother you with it. You've been so stressed with your own work. Her answer didn't sit right with me. Karen wasn't the type to keep things from me, especially something as simple as a work meeting. In the way she refused to meet my eyes, it was like she was trying to hide behind her words. Karen, I said, my voice softening but still firm, I need you to be honest with me. This doesn't feel like nothing. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? She sighed, her shoulders slumping as she turned back to the stove. I don't know, she mumbled. Maybe I thought you'd make a big deal out of it, like you are now. I stood up and crossed the room, placing the receipt on the counter in front of her. I wouldn't be making a big deal out of it if it actually wasn't a big deal, I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. But you're acting like you have something to hide, Karen. Do you? Her hands tightened around the wooden spoon she was holding, and for a moment, I thought she was going to tell me the truth. But instead, she shook her head. I'm not hiding anything, she said quietly. Can we just drop it? Drop it. Like it was that easy. I nodded, but inside, the doubt was eating away at me. The Karen I knew wouldn't have shut down like that. She wouldn't have avoided my questions or acted like I was the problem. Something wasn't right, and no matter how much I wanted to believe her, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. It was a Saturday morning in late spring, one of those days when the sunshine streaming through the windows makes you feel like you should tackle your to-do list. Karen had left early to run errands, so I decided to spend the day organizing the house. Our bedroom, in particular, had become a dumping ground for old bills, loose papers, and forgotten receipts. It felt good to clear some space, therapeutic, even. I started with the nightstands, sorting through Karen's drawer first. Most of it was the usual, magazines, an old lotion bottle, a tangle of phone chargers. But then I found a folded piece of paper tucked at the very back, almost like it had been intentionally hidden. Curious, I opened it. It took me a second to process what I was looking at. Across the top were the words DNA test results in bold. My stomach dropped as my eyes skimmed the rest of the document. The results were definitive. The child I had been raising, the child I had loved and cherished for years, wasn't biologically mine. I sat down on the bed, the paper trembling in my hands. My mind raced with questions. Why would Karen take a DNA test? Who else would she even suspect? And more importantly, why hadn't she told me? For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the paper, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm of confusion and anger. This wasn't just some oversight or misunderstanding, this was a secret she had deliberately kept from me. A secret that tore at the foundation of everything I thought we had. When Karen came home later that afternoon, she was humming to herself, carrying bags of groceries like it was just another ordinary day. I waited until she had put everything away before calling her into the living room. I didn't want to explode in anger, I needed answers, but I also needed her to know how serious this was. Karen, I said, holding up the paper. What is this? Her smile froze, and all the color drained from her face. Where did you find that? She whispered, her voice barely audible. In the bedroom, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Hidden in the back of the drawer. Why didn't you tell me about this? She stared at the paper in my hand, her eyes wide and glassy. She started, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, and she covered her face with her hands. I don't know how to explain. I didn't want to hurt you. Well, you succeeded at that, I said, my voice rising despite my best efforts. What the hell is going on, Karen? Whose child is this? And why the hell do I have to find out like this? For a moment, she just cried, her shoulders shaking as she tried to collect herself. Then she looked up at me, her face red and tear-streaked. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I never meant for you to find out this way." "Then tell me the truth," I said, leaning forward. "Who is it? Who's the father?" Karen hesitated, biting her lip so hard I thought it might bleed. Finally, she looked me straight in the eye and said the words that shattered what little composure I had left. "It's David," she said. "It might be David." The room seemed to tilt, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt the blood rush to my head, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "David?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "My brother? Are you telling me that my brother?" "Yes," she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "It was a mistake. I didn't want it to happen, but he manipulated me. I didn't know how to stop it." I stared at her, my mind racing to piece together this new reality. "Manipulated you?" I said, my voice rising. "You're telling me you slept with him, my own brother, and now you're trying to pin it on manipulation?" Karen broke down again, sobbing into her hands. "You don't understand," she cried. "He threatened me. He said if I didn't go along with it, he'd tell you lies. He'd ruin everything." I was scared, and I didn't know what else to do. I stood up, pacing the room, my hands running through my hair. "So you thought keeping it a secret was the solution? Raising this child as mine while I couldn't even finish the sentence." The betrayal was too overwhelming. "It wasn't like that," Karen said, her voice desperate. "I love you. I've always loved you. I wanted to protect you, to protect our family." "Protect me?" I shouted, unable to contain the anger boiling over. "You think lying to me was protecting me? You think hiding this from me for years was some kind of favor?" Karen collapsed onto the couch, her body racked with sobs. But I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. All I could think about was the years I had spent loving a child that might not even be mine, the years I had spent trusting a wife who had been carrying this secret all along. And then there was David. The thought of him, smug and manipulative as always, made my blood boil. He'd taken so much from me over the years, my childhood peace, my confidence, my sense of fairness, and now this. He'd crossed a line I didn't even know existed, and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to forgive him, or Karen, for what they'd done. After Karen's confession, I couldn't think straight. My hands were shaking, my chest felt tight, and it was like every memory I had with my brother was tainted. I paced around the house, trying to figure out what to do next. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I needed answers. I needed him to look me in the eye and explain himself. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through my contacts. When I found his name, I hit call without hesitating. The phone rang a few times before he picked up. "Hey, what's up?" David's voice was casual, almost cheerful, like he hadn't just upended my entire life. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold. "Now." There was a pause on the other end. "Okay," he said cautiously. "Where?" "There's a cafe on West Main Street, about 10 minutes from my house. Meet me there in an hour." He tried to ask what it was about, but I didn't give him the chance. I hung up and stared at my phone, my heart pounding. I didn't know exactly what I was going to say, but I knew I needed to confront him face to face. The cafe was one of those small, local spots that always smelled like freshly ground coffee and baked goods. Normally, I'd feel at ease there, but not that day. I arrived early and sat at a table near the back, my hands gripping the edge of my coffee cup so tightly I thought it might crack. The place was quiet, with only a handful of other customers scattered around. The hum of conversation and the faint sound of indie music playing in the background did nothing to calm my nerves. When David walked in, I felt a surge of anger so strong it almost made me stand up right then and there. He strolled in like he didn't have a care in the world, wearing his usual cocky smirk. He spotted me, raised a hand in a casual wave, and made his way over. "Hey, bro," he said, sliding into the seat across from me like this was just another catch-up over coffee. "What's this about?" I didn't waste any time. I pulled the crumpled DNA test out of my pocket and slammed it onto the table. "What the hell did you do to my family?" I demanded, my voice low but firm. David glanced at the paper and then back at me, completely unfazed. "You're really going to make a scene over this," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It's not like I forced her. Karen's a grown woman. She made her choices." Hearing him talk about Karen like that, like she was just some object he could manipulate, sent a fresh wave of rage through me. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my temper in check. "Don't you dare pin this on her," I said through gritted teeth. "You threatened her. You used her fear against her, and you think you can just shrug it off?" David shrugged, his smirk never leaving his face. "Look, I'm not saying I'm perfect, but let's be real, she didn't exactly say no, did she? Maybe she realized I'm better at giving her what she wants. That was it." I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my fist onto the table so hard the coffee cup rattled, drawing a few startled glances from nearby customers. "You're disgusting," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You're my brother. My brother. Do you even understand what you've done? You've destroyed everything." David leaned forward, his expression turning cold. "You think I care about your little pity party? You've always acted like you're better than me, like you're the golden boy. Maybe I just wanted to remind you that you're not as perfect as you think." Before I even realized what I was doing, I was out of my chair and grabbing him by the collar. "You've gone too far this time," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You've ruined everything, and you're sitting here acting like it's a joke." David didn't flinch. If anything, he looked amused, like he was enjoying seeing me lose control. "What are you gonna do, huh?" he taunted. "Punch me? Go ahead. Let's see how far that gets you." For a moment, I wanted to. I wanted to hit him so hard he'd finally understand the damage he'd caused. But then I stopped myself. Hitting him wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't change what he'd done or undo the pain he'd caused. It would just bring me down to his level, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. I let go of his collar and stepped back, taking a deep breath to steady myself. "You're pathetic," I said, my voice shaking but steady enough. "You think you've won, don't you? But all you've done is destroy yourself. You've lost me, and you've lost whatever shred of decency you had left." David rolled his eyes, brushing off his shirt as if I'd spilled coffee on him. "Spare me the lecture," he said. "You'll get over it. You always do." I shook my head, my anger turning into something colder, sharper. "Stay away from me," I said, my voice firm. "Stay away from Karen, and stay away from my family. If I see you again, I won't be responsible for what happens next." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the cafe. The cool spring air hit my face as I stepped outside, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I'd confronted David, but it didn't feel like a victory. If anything, it felt like a hollow, bitter ending to a chapter one never wanted to write in the first place. Driving home from that confrontation with David, my mind was spinning. The anger I'd felt during our meeting hadn't gone away, but now it was mixed with exhaustion and a hollow ache that wouldn't go away. As much as I wanted to erase the last few days, the truth was out there, and there was no going back. I thought about Karen's tearful confession, about the child upstairs waiting for me to come home, blissfully unaware of the chaos swirling around him. I didn't know what to do, only that I had to do something. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked so normal. The porch light cast a soft glow over the lawn, and I could see the faint flicker of the TV through the living room curtains. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to muster the courage to walk inside. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, the cool evening air hitting my face as I made my way to the front door. Karen was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up when I walked in, and the guilt and pain on her face were almost too much to bear. She stood as I came closer, wringing her hands nervously. "I didn't know if you'd come back," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't say anything at first. Instead, I looked past her to the stairs, where I could hear our son playing in his room, his laughter carrying faintly through the house. That sound, that pure, innocent sound, cut through the fog in my mind. I realized that no matter how angry I was, no matter how betrayed I felt, the decision I made tonight wasn't just about Karen or David. It was about him, too. "I came back," I finally said, my voice heavy. "But I don't know where we go from here." Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "I'll go to therapy. I'll move out if that's what you want. I just don't want to lose you." I sat down on the couch, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. "It's not that simple," I said, staring at the floor. "This isn't just about you and me. It's about him." I gestured toward the stairs. "He's my son, Karen. I don't care what that piece of paper says. I've been there for him every day of his life. I've held him when he cried, taught him how to ride a bike, read him bedtime stories. That doesn't just disappear." Karen sank to the floor in front of me, her hands clasped together like she was praying. "I know I've ruined everything," she said. "But I swear, I never wanted this to happen. I love you. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you let me." I leaned back, closing my eyes as her words washed over me. A part of me wanted to scream, to tell her it wasn't enough, that no amount of apologies could fix what had been broken. But another part of me, the part that had built a life with her, that had dreamed of growing old together, couldn't let go so easily. "You have to understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again. But for him, for our family, I'm willing to try. But it's going to take time. And things have to change." Karen nodded quickly, wiping her tears. "I'll do anything," she said. "Anything." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of everything hanging heavy in the air. Eventually, I stood up and headed upstairs to check on our son. He was sitting cross-legged on his bed, surrounded by Lego pieces, building what looked like a spaceship. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Hey, Dad! Look at this," he said, holding up his creation. I forced a smile, sitting down on the edge of his bed. "That's awesome, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. He grinned and went back to the building, completely oblivious to the storm raging in my heart. As I watched him, I felt a sense of clarity. No matter what happened with Karen, I couldn't let my anger and pain destroy the life we'd built together. This boy was innocent in all of this, and he deserved the best version of me, not the broken, bitter one. He was my son, DNA be damned, and I would do whatever it took to protect him. That night, after he was asleep, Karen and I talked more. We didn't solve everything, not even close. But for the first time in days, I felt like there was a glimmer of hope, however faint. The road ahead was going to be hard, maybe even impossible, but for now, we were still standing. And that had to count for something. The decision to move wasn't easy, but it felt necessary. Every corner of our current city was tied to memories I couldn't escape, places we had spent holidays, restaurants where we'd celebrated anniversaries, and even the neighborhood park where I taught my son how to swing a bat. And then there were the darker memories, the places where David had inserted himself into our lives, the moments that left scars I couldn't ignore. Staying meant constantly reliving those moments. If we were going to have any chance at healing, we had to leave. After weeks of discussion, Karen and I settled on Austin, Texas. It was far enough away to feel like a fresh start, but not so distant that it would uproot our entire way of life. I'd visited Austin once years ago for work and remembered it as vibrant but laid back, a city with a mix of music, food, and culture that felt like it could be a good fit for us. Plus, the job market was strong, and the schools were excellent for our son. I made it clear, though, this move came with conditions. Karen and I weren't just packing up and pretending everything was fine. If we're doing this, I told her one night as we sat at the kitchen table with maps and job listings spread out before us, then we're doing it right. That means therapy, real therapy. Together and separately. You have to prove to me that things are going to change. Karen nodded, her expression serious. I understand, she said. And I'll do whatever it takes. I know I've said that before, but I mean it. I want this to work. I wasn't sure I believed her yet, but I knew she was trying. And for now, that was enough to move forward. The move itself was chaos, as moves always are. We spent weeks packing up boxes, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. I tried to focus on the logistics, hiring movers, setting up utilities in Austin, arranging for our son's school transfer, but every now and then, I'd come across something that stopped me in my tracks. An old photo album, a forgotten memento from our wedding, a crayon drawing our son had made when he was 3. Each one felt like a test, a reminder of what we'd built and what we were fighting to save. By the time moving day arrived, I was running on adrenaline and caffeine. Karen, to her credit, stayed focused and kept the process moving. She seemed determined to prove she was committed to this fresh start. As the moving truck pulled out of the driveway and we locked the door to our old house for the last time, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. This was the house where we had built our life together, the good parts and the bad. Leaving it felt like closing a chapter, but I hoped it was a chapter we were better off leaving behind. Austin greeted us with warm sunshine and the smell of barbecue drifting through the air. We'd rented a modest house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't fancy, but it felt right. 3 bedrooms, a big backyard for our son to play in, and enough space for us to breathe. The first few weeks were all about settling in. Unpacking boxes, meeting the neighbors, finding a new favorite grocery store. Our son adjusted surprisingly well, making friends quickly and coming home with stories about his new school. For him, the move was an adventure, a chance to explore something new. I envied his resilience. For Karen and me, the adjustment was more complicated. True to our agreement, we started therapy almost immediately. Once a week, we met with a no-nonsense therapist named Dr. Michaels, whose office was in a converted bungalow near downtown. The first few sessions were brutal. Dr. Michaels didn't let either of us off the hook, forcing us to confront the pain and betrayal head-on. There were tears, raised voices, and long silences. But there were also moments of clarity, small breakthroughs that made me think maybe, just maybe, this was worth the effort. Outside of therapy, Karen made a point to show me she was serious about rebuilding our trust. She was transparent about her schedule, checking in regularly and sharing details about her day. She deleted old contacts from her phone, including David, and assured me she'd cut all ties with him. I'd be lying if I said I didn't still check her phone sometimes when she wasn't looking, but over time, those moments of suspicion became less frequent. One evening, a few months after we'd settled in, we were sitting in the backyard watching our son chase fireflies. The warm glow of the Texas sunset bathed everything in golden light, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Do you think this is working? Karen asked quietly, breaking the silence. I took a sip of my beer, considering our question. I don't know, I admitted. But I think we're trying. And that's more than I thought we'd be able to say a few months ago. She nodded, her gaze fixed on our son as he laughed and darted across the yard. I know I can't undo what I've done, she said. But I want to build something better. For us. For him. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I watched our son, his joy unclouded by the struggles Karen and I were facing. We'll see, I said finally. One day at a time. The road ahead wasn't easy, and I knew it wouldn't be. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of a new beginning, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe Austin really could be the fresh start we needed. I still don't know if we'll ever be the same as we were before. Maybe that version of us is gone for good. But what I do know is this: every family has its breaking points. Every marriage faces moments that test its limits. And while some don't survive, others find a way to rebuild, not perfectly, but honestly. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know this family deserves a second chance. And for now, that's enough.